She let a broke janitor feed her bread for 8 months, knowing his father was the man she destroyed 15 years earlier. He had no idea who she was. She never forgot who he was. Every single morning, before the sun had fully risen over the city, a young man named George Reid walked 3 blocks out of his way just to buy a loaf of warm bread for a woman he did not know. She sat on the same bench outside the same bakery, wrapped in a coat too thin for the cold, and she never once asked him for anything. George never asked her name either. He simply handed her the bread, said good morning, and went on to his overnight cleaning shift at one of the largest office towers downtown. He had no idea that the woman on that bench held more power in her hands than anyone he had ever met in his life, and he certainly had no idea that her decisions, made more than a decade earlier, were the exact reason his own father lost everything he had worked for. For 8 months, this became George's quiet ritual, something he never told his coworkers about because he knew they would laugh, and something he never told his mother about because he knew she would worry. He did not do it to be seen. He did not do it for a reward. He did it because somewhere along the way, George had learned that kindness costs nothing but means everything to the person receiving it. What he could not have known, what nobody watching him could have known, was that this simple act of feeding a stranger was about to unravel a secret buried for 15 years, one that connected his family's greatest loss to the very woman he had been quietly caring for all along. Who was this woman, really, and why did she choose that exact bench, at that exact hour, every single day, when she could have chosen anywhere else in the world to sit? Why did a black car idle at the far end of the street some mornings, never approaching, as though someone were keeping watch over her from a careful distance? And why, the very first time George mentioned his father's old job at some big company downtown, did her expression shift for just a moment before she covered it with a smile? This is the story of a janitor who believed he was helping a woman with nothing left, and a woman who was quietly watching a young man who reminded her of a decision she had never forgiven herself for making. Before this story ends, a friendship built on nothing but bread and quiet mornings will be tested by a truth neither of them was ready for, and it will end in a place nobody watching could have predicted. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. George Reid was 26 years old, and for most of his adult life, he had worked nights so that his days could be spent caring for his mother, Gloria Reid, in the small house they shared on the edge of the city. He had never gone to college, not because he lacked the mind for it, but because the year he graduated high school was the same year his father's income disappeared, and someone in the family needed to start bringing money home immediately. He never resented this. He simply adjusted his life around it, the way people do when love leaves them no other choice. Gloria had carried her own share of that burden long before George was old enough to help. In the years right after Elijah lost his position, she took on shifts at a laundry service during the day and cleaned houses on the weekends, often leaving before George woke for school and returning after he had already fallen asleep. She never complained about the exhaustion in front of him, choosing instead to save her tears for moments when she believed no one was watching. It was this same quiet endurance that George recognized in himself years later, standing outside a bakery at dawn, buying bread for a stranger simply because it was within his power to ease someone else's morning, the same way his mother had spent years quietly easing his without ever asking to be thanked for it. His father, Elijah Reid, had passed away 2 years earlier, but the weight of what happened to him in his final working years still lived inside that house like an uninvited guest that never left. 15 years before George ever picked up a bucket and mop, Elijah had been a floor supervisor at a manufacturing plant owned by Whitmore Holdings, a company that had once represented stability and pride for hundreds of families across the city. Elijah had worked there for nearly a decade, memorized every worker's name on his floor, and believed, the way many good men do, that loyalty was something a company could return in kind. Then, almost overnight, a wave of layoffs swept through the plant during a period of financial turmoil nobody on the floor understood or was ever given the full details of. Elijah Reid was one of the men let go, told simply that leadership had made a difficult decision to save the company from something bigger than any single employee. He was 43 years old at the time, with a wife and a 12-year-old son at home, and no warning beyond a single meeting that lasted less than 10 minutes. George had heard the story of that meeting so many times growing up that he could picture it, even though he had never once seen the room himself. His father was called off the floor during his shift, still wearing his work gloves, and led into a small office where two people he had never met before sat behind a folder with his name already printed on the front. There was no conversation about his 10 years of service, no mention of the extra shifts he had covered for men with new babies at home, no acknowledgement of the department he had built almost single-handedly from the ground up. He was simply told the position no longer existed, handed a folder explaining his final pay, and asked to collect his belongings by the end of the day. Elijah walked out of that building still wearing his work gloves, because nobody had told him to take them off, and he did not think to take them off himself until he was standing on the sidewalk outside, staring up at a building he had believed, until that morning, would carry him all the way to retirement. Elijah never fully recovered from that loss. He took smaller jobs, worked longer hours for less pay, and carried a quiet bitterness that George grew up watching from the sidelines without ever fully understanding it as a child. His mother rarely spoke about it directly, but George understood, even before he had the words for it, that his family's entire financial future had been reshaped by a decision made in a boardroom he had never seen, by people whose names he never knew and whose faces he never once had to imagine. He grew up believing that companies like Whitmore Holdings were faceless, that the people who made those decisions never had to look the families they affected in the eye. He never imagined that one of those decision-makers was sitting on a bench 3 blocks from his job. 2 years before George ever sat across from a stranger named Dorothy, his father's funeral took place in a small church on the same side of the city where the family had always lived. The service was modest, filled mostly by neighbors and a handful of older men who had worked beside Elijah on the plant floor decades earlier, men whose own careers had followed similarly uneven paths after the layoffs took their department apart. George stood beside his mother through the entire service, one arm around her shoulders, doing what a son does when there is nothing left to say that would make the day any easier to survive. He did not notice, seated alone in the very last pew, a woman in a plain dark coat who arrived just after the service began and left before the final hymn finished, her face lowered the entire time as though she did not believe she had any right to be seen. Nobody in the family recognized her that day, and nobody thought to ask who she was among the small crowd of mourners. What George could not have known, and would not learn until much later, was that this had become a private habit of hers for years, one she had never spoken of to a single person. She read the local obituaries regularly, searching for the names of anyone who had once worked at a plant or facility under the Whitmore name, and when she found one, she quietly attended whatever service was held, sitting apart from the family, never introducing herself, never signing a guest book. Elijah Reid's funeral was one of dozens she had slipped into that way over the years. A private penance nobody had asked her to carry, and nobody but her would ever know she carried it all. She did not yet know his son's face. She only knew, standing at the back of that church, that another family had been left to grieve twice, once for the man they lost, and once for the years already taken from him before his death ever arrived. George took the overnight cleaning position at Whitmore Holdings' downtown tower almost by accident, applying because it was close to home and the pay was steady enough to help his mother with the bills that never seemed to stop arriving. He did not think twice about the name on the building when he signed his paperwork. To him, it was simply where he worked, a place he moved through quietly between midnight and dawn while everyone else in the city slept. It was on his walk to that very building each morning that he first noticed the elderly woman sitting outside the bakery, always alone, always watching the tower's top floor light up before anyone else arrived for the day. He assumed she had nowhere else to go. He never once considered that she might be watching that building because, in some private way, it belonged to her. The first time George noticed her shivering, he did not think, he simply acted. He walked into the bakery, bought a warm loaf of bread with money he could not really spare, and set it gently on the bench beside her without a word. She looked up at him, surprised, and asked why a young man in a worn work uniform would spend his own money on a stranger who had nothing to offer in return. George told her that his mother always said nobody should start their day cold and hungry if he had it in his power to change that, even in some small way. The woman studied him for a long moment, thanked him quietly, and that single exchange became the beginning of something neither of them expected to continue for as long as it did. Each morning after that, George brought the same warm loaf, and each morning, the woman was there waiting, though she never once told him why she came to that exact spot. Slowly, their conversations grew longer than either of them planned. She asked about his mother, his work, his dreams for a future he rarely allowed himself to think about out loud. George found himself talking more freely with her than he did with almost anyone else in his life, perhaps because she never judged him, never rushed him, and never asked for anything beyond honest conversation. He never learned her full name in those early weeks. She simply told him to call her Dorothy, and he never thought to ask for more than that. There were small details George noticed, but never questioned closely enough. Her coat was worn at the sleeves, but the watch on her wrist looked expensive, out of place against the rest of her appearance. A black car sometimes idled at the far end of the street, never approaching, never leaving either, as though someone were keeping a careful distance while still keeping watch. Once, George mentioned that his father used to work at some big company downtown before things went wrong for their family, and Dorothy's expression changed for just a moment, a flicker George almost missed, before she quickly covered it with a smile and changed the subject to something lighter. George did not think much of it at the time. He had no reason to connect an old man's forgotten job to a quiet woman on a bench who seemed to have nothing left in the world but a coat and a place to sit. His coworkers teased him relentlessly once they discovered his morning ritual, calling him foolish for spending his limited money on someone who could never repay him and who might not even remember his name from one day to the next. His mother, when she finally learned about it, grew quietly concerned, worried that her son was being taken advantage of by a stranger who might not be entirely who she claimed to be. George brushed off every warning without much thought. To him, the woman on the bench was simply someone who needed a little bit of warmth in the morning, and he had never once believed that kindness needed a reason beyond itself to be worth giving. There was one morning, weeks before that final question, when Dorothy came close to telling George everything herself. She had asked him, almost carefully, what he would want from someone who had hurt his family without ever meaning to, someone who had made a decision that felt necessary at the time, but had never stopped costing other people long after the decision was made. George, without knowing she was asking about herself, answered honestly that he would want the truth, plainly stated, without excuses wrapped around it to make it easier to hear. Dorothy grew quiet after that, staring at the tower across the street for a long moment, and George assumed she was simply tired. She almost spoke again. He watched her open her mouth once, then close it, then change the subject entirely, asking instead about his mother's health. George did not think anything of it at the time. He had no way of knowing he had just watched a woman come within a single sentence of confessing exactly who she was, only to lose her nerve at the very last moment. Then came the morning that changed everything between them. Dorothy asked George his last name, something she had never asked in 8 months of quiet mornings together, and something George found strange even as he answered without hesitation. When he said, "Reid," her face went pale, the color draining from it so quickly that George almost reached out to steady her. For the first time since he had known her, she said nothing at all. She simply stood, gathered her coat around her shoulders, and walked away without finishing the bread he had brought her that morning. George stood alone on that corner, confused, holding half a loaf of bread and wondering what he had possibly said wrong. She did not return to that bench the next morning, or the morning after that, or the morning after that. 3 days passed with no sign of Dorothy, and George found himself unable to stop thinking about her sudden disappearance, replaying their last conversation over and over for any clue he might have missed. He began asking around his workplace, describing the woman from the bench to coworkers who had passed her before on their own way into the building, hoping someone might know something he did not. It was a coworker in the break room, scrolling absently through a company newsletter on her phone, who finally showed George a flyer for an upcoming shareholder town hall. And there, in a photograph at the top of the page, was the woman from the bench, dressed now in a tailored blazer instead of a worn coat, her posture entirely different from the woman he had come to know. Beneath her photograph was a name George had heard his entire childhood in his father's most exhausted, most bitter moments: Dorothy Whitmore, Chief Executive Officer of Whitmore Holdings. George stood frozen in the break room, the flyer trembling slightly in his hand as the noise of the room seemed to fall away around him. The woman he had been feeding bread to every single morning for 8 months, the woman he had spoken to about his mother, his hopes, his quiet frustrations with life, was the very person whose company had let his father go 15 years earlier. He thought back to every conversation, every flinch, every moment her expression had shifted when certain topics came up, and suddenly all of it made a painful kind of sense that settled heavily in his chest. He felt betrayed, not because she had lied to him outright, but because she had let him believe she was simply a lonely old woman with nothing, when in truth she held more history over his family than anyone else alive. The same coworker who had shown him the flyer, a woman named Joyce who had worked the overnight cleaning shift for nearly a decade, pulled George aside once she saw his face change. She had been at Whitmore Holdings long enough to remember the layoffs herself, though from a different department, and she told George something he had not considered in the shock of the moment, that speaking openly against the CEO, even about something that happened 15 years ago, was not something anyone at his level did without risk. She had watched other employees raise old grievances before, only to find their hours quietly cut or their names left off schedules the following month. She was not telling him to stay silent. She was telling him, as someone who had learned it the hard way, that whatever he decided to do next would cost him something, and he deserved to walk into it with his eyes open rather than his anger leading the way. George thanked her, though her warning did little to slow the questions already circling in his mind. That night, George could not sleep. He sat at his kitchen table long after his mother had gone to bed, replaying his father's old stories, the exhaustion in Elijah Reid's voice whenever he mentioned the people upstairs who had decided his fate without ever meeting him face to face or learning his name. George realized he had spent 8 months unknowingly building a friendship with one of those very people, the one who had signed the decision that changed his family forever. Anger rose in him slowly, quiet but heavy, the kind of anger that does not arrive in a single moment but accumulates from years of watching someone he loved carry a wound that never fully healed. He seriously considered never returning to that corner again, letting the bread in the mornings end exactly where the truth had finally caught up. He thought about the version of events that would have been easiest to believe, the one where Dorothy was simply a stranger who happened to share a coincidental connection to his family's past, nothing more. But George had never been able to lie to himself for long, and he knew, sitting alone at that table, that this had not been a coincidence at all. She had chosen that bench. She had chosen that corner, across from that tower, morning after morning, long before he ever noticed her there. He turned the question over in his mind for hours. Had she known who he was from the very beginning, or had the truth arrived for her the same way it had arrived for him, as an unwelcome surprise neither of them had asked for? He could not decide which possibility angered him more, that she had known and said nothing, or that fate had simply placed them across from each other and let the years catch up on their own schedule. Sleep never came that night, only the slow, circling weight of a question he was not ready to answer. It was his mother, Gloria, who changed his mind, though not in the way George expected. When he finally told her everything, bracing himself for her anger to match his own, she instead grew quiet and thoughtful, staring at nothing for a long moment before she spoke. She reminded George that his father never blamed one single woman for what happened to their family. He blamed a system that made decisions without faces, without names, without anyone ever having to sit across from the families those decisions affected. Gloria told her son that if this woman had shown him genuine kindness in return, had spoken to him honestly in those quiet mornings without ever needing to, then perhaps his father's story and this woman's story were not as separate as George currently believed them to be. She encouraged him to go back one more time, not to forgive on behalf of his father, but to hear the full truth for himself before deciding what to do with any of it. George returned to the corner one final time, unsure whether Dorothy would even be there after everything that had happened. She was seated in her usual spot, though this time she did not wait for him to speak first. She admitted, quietly and without excuse or defense, exactly who she was and why she had never told him the truth. She explained that the corner outside that bakery was not random at all, and never had been. It was directly across the street from the very first store her own father had opened decades earlier, the humble beginning of everything that eventually grew into Whitmore Holdings. She had been coming to that spot for years, long before George ever noticed her sitting there, as a private way of remembering where it all started before the company grew into something capable of decisions large enough to destroy families like his. Dorothy told George that the layoffs 15 years earlier had come during a hostile takeover attempt that nearly cost her the entire company her father had built from nothing, and that approving those cuts, including his father's position among dozens of others, was a decision she had never once stopped carrying with her in the years since. She said she had spent years afterward quietly funding scholarship and job placement programs for the families affected by that decision, without ever attaching her name to any of it publicly, because she did not believe her guilt should come with recognition attached. What she had not known, until George said his last name out loud on that ordinary morning, was that one of those very programs had once been offered directly to his own mother, Gloria Reid, who had quietly declined it years earlier out of pride, never once telling her son that it had existed at all. Dorothy remembered the exact letter that had gone out to Gloria Reid nearly 10 years earlier, a modest offer of tuition assistance and job placement support extended anonymously through a third-party foundation, never once mentioning Whitmore Holdings by name. Gloria had read that letter at her kitchen table late one night, the same table where George would one day sit sleepless with his own anger, and she had folded it back into its envelope without responding. She told no one about it, not even Elijah, who was still alive at the time and already fragile with the exhaustion of rebuilding a life from less than he had before. Gloria's reasoning was simple and unbending. She did not want charity from a company that had never once apologized for what it took from her family, and she would rather struggle on her own terms than accept help wrapped in silence. She threw the letter into a drawer instead of the trash, unable to fully discard it, and it stayed there for years, unopened by anyone else, a small unspoken piece of pride that George never knew existed until the truth of that program surfaced 15 years later on a different corner of the city entirely. George sat in stunned silence as Dorothy explained that the bread he brought her every morning had become something she never expected to need in her life. It was not charity to her, not in any sense. It was the first honest kindness anyone had shown her in years that had nothing at all to do with her money, her title, or her last name. To George, she had simply been Dorothy, a woman with a worn coat and a quiet bench. To her, he had become quiet proof that decency still existed in a world that had spent years treating her only as a signature on difficult decisions made from behind closed doors. Neither of them had understood the full weight of what the other was carrying until that very moment on that ordinary corner. In the days that followed, Dorothy did something George did not expect. Instead of simply offering him a position within Whitmore Holdings, she asked to meet his mother in person, a request George almost refused on Gloria's behalf, certain his mother would never agree to sit across from the woman connected to his father's firing. To his surprise, Gloria agreed, and the two women met for the first time in Gloria's small living room, not as chief executive and grieving widow, but as two people who had each carried opposite ends of the very same 15-year-old wound. Dorothy did not arrive with a check or a prepared statement. She arrived only with the truth, admitting out loud something she had never said publicly in all those years, that Elijah Reid had been one of the finest supervisors that plant ever had, and that letting him go was a decision she had regretted the moment she signed her name to it. Gloria listened without saying a word while Dorothy spoke, her expression unreadable at first, until something in Dorothy's face seemed to catch her attention in a way that had nothing to do with the apology itself. She studied Dorothy for a long moment, tilting her head slightly, and then asked a question that had nothing to do with layoffs or scholarships at all. She asked Dorothy if she had ever attended a funeral at a small church on the east side of the city 2 years earlier, in early autumn. Dorothy went still. She admitted, quietly, that she had, and that she had sat in the last pew and left before the final hymn, the same way she always did at services she had no right to attend. Gloria's eyes filled with tears she did not bother to hide. She told Dorothy she remembered a woman in a dark coat who slipped out early that day, and that she had wondered for 2 years who it could have been, never imagining the answer would walk into her living room to apologize for something that happened 15 years before that funeral ever took place. Gloria listened to every word without interruption, and when Dorothy finished speaking, she said something that surprised even George. She told Dorothy that grief does not need an apology to soften it, but it does need honesty, and honesty was something no one from that company had ever offered her family in 15 years until this very afternoon. The two women sat together for hours after that, and by the time Dorothy left, something quietly shifted between all three of them that no contract or job offer could have accomplished on its own. When Dorothy formally offered George a new position within the company days later, he accepted, but not for the reasons she expected. He did not ask for a higher title or a larger salary. Instead, he asked for something far smaller and far more meaningful to him personally. That every new employee hired at Whitmore Holdings spend one morning during their onboarding buying bread for someone in the surrounding neighborhood, with no explanation given beyond a single instruction, to start their very first day by giving something away before they received anything at all. Dorothy agreed immediately, moved by how little George had asked for given everything his family had lost. Before George started his new position, he visited his father's grave alone, something he had not done in several months, carrying with him a small loaf of bread from the same bakery where it had all begun. He did not leave it at the headstone the way some people leave flowers. He sat on the grass beside it instead, broke the loaf in half, and ate slowly while he told his father everything: the bench, the woman, the company, the truth neither of them had ever expected to surface after 15 years of silence. He told his father that he was not doing this for forgiveness on his behalf, because that was not his to give away. He was doing it because he finally understood that his father's story had never truly ended the day he lost his job. It had simply been waiting, quietly, for someone to carry it forward into a different kind of ending. The tradition began quietly, without any announcement or press release, exactly as George wanted it. Within a year, without George's knowledge, employees throughout the company had started calling it George's Morning. A small ritual passed from one new hire to the next, long before most of them ever learned the full story behind why it existed. When Dorothy finally told George what his co-workers had named it, he laughed for the first time in weeks, insisting he had never asked for anything to be named after him. Dorothy told him that some things get named not because a person asks for it, but because people cannot help but remember where real kindness started. Nearly a year into the tradition, a young woman named Patricia joined the company's accounting department, and on her very first morning, she was handed the same instruction every new hire received: to buy bread for someone in the neighborhood before arriving for her first day, with no explanation beyond the instruction itself. Patricia nearly skipped it, uncertain why an accounting job would begin with an errand that had nothing to do with spreadsheets or budgets. She bought the bread anyway and gave it to an older man sitting outside a laundromat 2 blocks from the office, a man who thanked her with a kind of surprise that suggested nobody had done something like that for him in longer than he cared to admit. Weeks later, during a casual conversation in the break room, Patricia mentioned her father's name in passing while explaining why she had taken the accounting job in the first place. A man named Walter Combs, who had worked at a Whitmore plant decades earlier before retiring quietly and passing away when Patricia was still a teenager. George, sitting only a few feet away, went completely still. He knew that name. His father had spoken it at their kitchen table more times than George could count, always with the same warmth reserved for very few people. Walter Combs had been the floor veteran who trained a nervous, 23-year-old Elijah Reid on his very first week at the plant, decades before either of their sons would ever meet. Elijah used to say that Walter taught him everything that mattered without ever raising his voice once, and that Walter always kept a peppermint candy in his shirt pocket for any new hire too anxious to eat breakfast before their first shift. George asked Patricia, carefully, if her father had ever kept peppermints in his shirt pocket. Patricia's face changed instantly, the color rising to her cheeks as she asked how George could possibly know something so specific and so small. George told her the whole story then, of a father he had lost, a mentor she had barely known, and a single detail that had somehow survived 15 years, one funeral, and 2 separate families to land between them in an ordinary break room on an ordinary afternoon. Patricia had grown up with almost no memories of her father's working years, only vague impressions from old photographs, and George, without meaning to, had just handed her back a piece of him she never knew existed. Neither of them finished their coffee that afternoon. They simply sat there, trading stories about 2 men who had once stood on the same factory floor, one teaching the other how to begin a life neither of their sons could have imagined would eventually connect them. The story closes on an ordinary morning, months later, with George and Dorothy back on that same corner outside the bakery, sharing a single loaf of bread between them as equals, no longer defined by the titles of janitor and chief executive that once stood between them without either of them knowing it. George never set out to change a company, and he certainly never set out to heal a 15-year-old wound inside his own family. He simply did not want anyone to start their morning cold and hungry if he had it in his power to change that. Somehow, that single decision, repeated quietly for 8 months, was enough to change everything for everyone it eventually touched. If you were in George's position, do you believe you could have forgiven Dorothy the way he did, knowing what her decision once cost your own family? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming stories, because there are so many more people out there whose quiet kindness is changing lives in ways they may never fully understand.